Thank you, Robert. In terms of questions, as I mentioned, there will be a session after each presentation, plus a longer discussion at the end. Do note that we asked parties to send questions ahead of time, and some of you did. So with those, we will try to answer and weave through our presentation as we present. So thank you very much to all of you who went through the effort of sending that. It has helped us structure our time today. We will follow up to respond to any unanswered questions or additional questions that come up on the workshop. If you have some clarifying questions, just very specific during the presentation, and then you may add it to the chat, and we'll try to get to it. Our IT support is Francisco Hernandez and Robert Stanford, in case any of you do need that information, and hopefully Francisco and Robert can put their contact on the chat in case they're needed. Now, just a brief recap on this proceeding. Phase 1 consisted of an assessment of SoCalGas and Sempra's safety culture, and that resulted in a report being issued in January of 2022. So that's been 3 years since the report was issued. There were recommendations for SoCalGas, Sempra, and the CPUC. We are now in phase 2. There was a decision issued last year that rejected and adopted some initiatives submitted by SoCalGas and Sempra. The initiatives were in response to the requirement to submit an improvement plan in response to the results of the assessment that was issued in phase 1. In September 20th of last year, SoCalGas and Sempra filed a revised plan, and the Safety Policy Division developed a staff report with an evaluation of that plan, which was issued earlier this year via ruling for all of you to review. So in today's workshop, we will be going over that evaluation. Now I would like to hand it over to Commissioner Haug for some opening remarks. Commissioner Haug, over to you.
Thank you, Carolina. Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to today's workshop. As was stated, this workshop is part of the SoCalGas and Sempra OII on safety culture, I-19-06-014. This proceeding is one of 3 proceedings before the Commission that were open due to significant safety incidents involving SoCalGas. SoCalGas is the largest gas investor-owned utility in Southern California. The purpose of this particular proceeding, consistent with the name of the proceeding, is to take a deep dive into SoCalGas and Sempra's safety culture. A main focus of the proceeding is how to best oversee and develop the actions needed to respond to deficiencies and improve the utility's safety culture. In the first phase of the proceeding, as Carolina indicated, the Commission utilized an independent third-party consultant to conduct a safety culture assessment of SoCalGas and Sempra. The second phase of the proceeding focuses on developing a consistent understanding of the factors fundamental to safety culture, the benefits of having a strong safety culture, examining why such a safety culture is fundamental to safe utility operations, and how to identify and implement improvements that will support a safety culture at SoCalGas and Sempra. Today, we're going to hear from Safety Policy Division staff, as well as Dr. Mark Fleming on the Safety Policy Division report and evaluation of the revised improvement plan. We're also going to hear from SoCalGas and Sempra regarding their revised safety culture improvement plan. So it should be a good discussion today from all those that have been involved in putting forward the plan and the staff report. It's critical that we continue to develop, foster, and maintain a safety culture for the electric and gas investor-owned utilities. SoCalGas has been closely coordinating with the Commission Safety Policy Division staff to improve the plan that they previously submitted. Because of this work and the direction in this proceeding, we anticipate significant progress to be made with respect to the revised plan and appreciate all of the time and effort that the utilities, the parties, and the staff have contributed to this process. Again, I'm looking forward to hearing from the staff from SoCalGas and the questions that parties and participants may have today. So I'd like to close by again thanking Safety Policy Division, our Administrative Law Division, Legal Division, IT, and the parties to this proceeding, all of the stakeholders who've provided input, and look forward to hearing more, and again to the Q&A discussion today. And with that, I will turn it back over to Carolina.
Thank you, Commissioner Hauk. So for today's presentation, we've issued the report and we trust that those interested have taken a chance to look at it. So our intent is really not to rehash the report as much, but rather we want to provide you with the depth and context necessary to understand our evaluation process and how we went about looking at the report. I think that would provide some useful insights for everybody to understand the report. As I mentioned, it's been about 3 years since the report was released, and it had a lot of rich information to digest. So we think it's worth just gleaning on what it means to interpret the results so that it can better inform our expectations and your expectations from SoCalGas in terms of an improvement approach. Okay, so in order to interpret the results, it's important to understand the assessment framework. So where did that come from? The 2EC team applied the and 2EC is the consultant that was retained to do the independent evaluation. They applied the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Agency assessments methodology. And the methodology is recognized as a best practice in the nuclear industry. I would remind everybody that the term safety culture was actually coined by the IAEA following the Chernobyl disaster to sort of explain the drivers behind that particular nuclear incident. It is influenced by Edgar Schein's 3 model of culture shown in the iceberg graphic to the left. And I would say that this is an outdated graphic, so please pay attention to the graphic that Dr. Fleming is going to show. That's a more updated representative graphic. What's important to keep in mind about this is that the focus of these assessments are on understanding the invisible aspects of culture that are hidden below the surface of the iceberg. You see this iceberg to the right. All those things that are unsaid, unconscious, rather than just visible aspects above the surface. Those are the tip of the iceberg that you see here. The tip of the iceberg is the formal, tangible systems, the practices, the metrics, etc., that we are all used to seeing and dealing with, at least at the Commission. And as a result, we're naturally inclined to focus on those. So it's important to continually remind ourselves that this methodology focuses on what's underneath the surface of the iceberg. It's also based on an exploratory approach. This means that it encourages the assessor to remain open to discover unexpected findings. So, you know, these types of unexpected findings would otherwise be missed when relying on predetermined metrics or assumptions, to put it that way. It also focuses on improvement rather than just identifying problems. So, for example, recommendations are overframed in a way that encourage reflection, dialogue, and continuous improvement across all levels of the organization. So this is why you would have seen high-level recommendations in the 2EC report. They're not very prescriptive. And presumably, those would foster ownership in the organization of the improvement process. So reason I'm mentioning all of this is because as well as for me, these characteristics really make it a very different type of assessment to a study that we normally are used to seeing at the Commission. So essentially because it focuses on the drivers of behavior rather than the formal structure of safety systems and practices and metrics that we typically see. So rather than just evaluating whether a corrective action program is working or not, an assessor using this type of methodology might discover that while the leadership team is consistently emphasizing safety in meetings, for example, frontline workers might feel there is insufficient follow-up on safety concerns. The nugget of information there is that leads to a trust gap. So that's something that, these tries to explain why things might not be working the way they should. So that's a diagnosis, but the organization then needs to dig further and figure out why this is actually happening. This is where the dialogues that SoCalGas and Sempra were recommended to hold come into play, but we will go into those a little bit further in a moment. So the assessment results provided different levels of information, and there's a lot of questions around what should be addressed. The reality is that there's a richness of information in the report that can be challenging to digest. So let's start at the very bottom. The descriptive analysis component of the assessment involved extracting cultural markers from all the data sets independently. These are, the cultural facts that are listed and referenced in the report. Those are also, some of those are noted as conclusions or data themes. These data themes are essentially a synthesized version of the cultural facts. So the collective analysis of these cultural facts and conclusions results in overarching themes. This is a broad generalization, generalized insights that identify the main areas of focus impacting the overall safety culture. So these highlight the key systemic organizational factors. So in summary, the cultural facts are the evidence for the picture of culture that is collectively represented by the overarching themes. And Dr. Fleming will get in a little bit more about where these come from and why they happen. So what did this look like for SoCalGas in the report? Essentially, what we have found is that at the very bottom, what we saw at the very bottom, you see the multiple data collection efforts implemented by 2EC. And the report listed over 150 plus cultural facts. And these are just the listed one. In reality, these are likely thousands of cultural facts because these were also rolled up into some further synthesized conclusions or / data themes, which I just mentioned earlier. And these cultural facts / data themes were noted, some as areas in need of attention and some as some positives that were just categorized as such. So these supported 4 overarching themes. So these were the evidence and support of 4 overarching themes that were found at SoCalGas. The first was about the conception of safety being narrowly viewed as occupational safety. The second was around a compliance mentality for safety. The third, around the need for resources to support a healthy safety culture. And the fourth, the prevalence of silos that limit SoCalGas's ability to learn and improve. So here is an example from the report. And again, this is just some aspects of the report's much richer with each of these categories. Each blue box represents a trait, and within it, there's a positive and negative cultural fact or conclusion data theme that were categorized under a trait. The report lists many of these cultural facts and conclusions, and these were just here selected for just representation. So these facts support the overarching theme. In this case, overarching theme 4, which explains that SoCalGas is highly siloed, which prevents it from learning and improving. So as you might notice, these cultural facts can also support other traits and overarching themes. So for example, the fact that many interviewees expressed the opinion that SoCalGas is a reactive organization, it could also help support the overarching theme 2, which describes SoCalGas as having a compliance mentality. So this helps explain how this evidence supports what's interrelated themes. So all of these themes, overarching themes, are interrelated. They don't exist alone or independently. So I think this helps us understand the assessment report's advice and key takeaways. Primarily, addressing one of the things that the 2EC report was very adamant of advising about the next phase was that addressing each of the areas in need of attention individually and by incremental improvement will not result in substantive or lasting change. They mentioned that it is best to address them in relation to the larger cultural forces. So what this means is to us essentially the underlying cultural factors driving the four overarching themes. Therefore, addressing issues requires systemic change rather than discrete corrective actions for each cultural fact. This was recognized by the scoping memo under issue 2, element 1, requiring the development of interventions that directly address the overarching themes. And this is as informed by the entire findings of the report, the conclusions, the recommendations, the areas in need of attention, the positive aspects, everything. But again, I don't want to confuse the two things. One is the cultural drivers, which is what the initiatives should be addressing, and the other one is having those be informed by everything else in the report. Another aspect, key takeaway of that assessment is that integration of the four themes identified is the final step to understanding what the culture means. And I'm just going to paraphrase, I'm just going to explain this, but essentially the report explains that these difficulties build on each other, and that without a clear, and with respect to the four themes, without a clear and robust concept of safety communication suffers. When safety communication suffers, decision-making and work processes cannot be directed towards safe choices. Without an environment for raising concerns, the problems and choices are not visible nor discussed, thereby problems are not identified proactively, and then SoCalGas does not learn. This finally weakens personal accountability for safety. And finally, the recommendations, we were advised not to be used as a checklist for corrective actions. I will now hand it over to Dr. Fleming, SPD Subject Matter Expert Advisor, who will discuss further the approach to improvement based on this specific type of assessment and which we used for our oversight of SoCalGas. Dr. Fleming is a professor from St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and an internationally recognized expert in safety culture. His experience working with both organizations and regulators has been invaluable to growing our internal expertise and understanding of safety culture in this regulated context. So over to you, Dr. Fleming.
Thanks, Carolina. Control this. So will I tell you to move the slides? Is that okay?
Yeah, please go ahead. I will manage this.
Okay, thank you so much. So can we move to the next slide, please? So Carolina mentioned earlier that she presented the iceberg model, and I think it's important to go back to that model to sort of understand what the assessment was trying to achieve and how we were collecting the information. So I was a small part of the 2EC team, but part of the process, we were looking at this SHINES model of culture, which was one of the fundamental frameworks that we use, which we've got artifacts, which are the things that you can see, espouse values. These are the things that people say is important, and when you ask them about safety, it's what they tell you. But what we're really interested in is the basic assumptions, which are the driver for the culture. And these are taken for granted: beliefs about safety, understanding of reality. These assumptions really drive your safety culture. So it's this sort of under the waterline, often subconscious ways of thinking and acting around safety that we're really quite interested in terms of understanding the culture. And this is what the assessment was trying to get at. Next slide, please, Carolina. And when we look then at the data collection, so there was a range of different methods that were used as part of the assessment. And in Carolina's presentation, she talked a little bit about that. So we had observations, document analysis, and then we had focus groups, interviews, and surveys. And these different methods already draw on the top layer, or the more visible aspects of the culture. So we have sort of artifacts, but we also have espoused values, which are sort of on the waterline, and we get those from focus groups, interviews, and surveys. So what's I think important to note is that none of the methods that we use to collect data from during the assessment are at the basic assumption level. So they're all at a higher level of something that's more sort of visible and tangible. And so then when we go and analyze that, what we're trying to do is to understand those things, right? So the next slide, please, Carolina. So what we do in that case is we have all the different methods, and again, this was represented by the image that Carolina had earlier. But again, we have the document analysis, the observation, the interviews, the perception survey, and the focus groups. And all of those sources of information were all analyzed separately so that we could understand really what was going on, to identify sort of themes. So often when we talk about something, we're not talking about one person said something, we're talking about something that was a common theme, say among interviews, or a common theme from observations or document analysis. It wasn't just a one-off thing. So there was a sort of an aggregation or an analysis that collected this information up into a wide range of themes that were quite important. So it's quite an important analysis process where we pull those things together. So can we get the next slide, Carolina, please? And then when you do that, when you identify those themes, sometimes the theme that we identify might be an area in need of attention, or it might be a positive observation. So at each of the sort of stages, we're able to sort of some of the themes that are identified are things that could be viewed by someone as positive, could be viewed by as a different theme could be viewed as being negative. But what's important is all of this information that we've identified separately then goes back into a process of analysis, and actually a much more intensive process of analysis. And in the case of the 2EC report, the team, with the exception of me because it was during COVID times, went to meet together and spent a week together working on all the information that had already been sort of partially analyzed, but then we're able to try and identify those overarching themes. And can we get the next slide, Carolina? And what really happens then is what we're trying to do is to identify those basic assumptions, those drivers that are influencing the culture. So we're trying to get to understand what's underneath the water. So we're taking the information that's above the waterline, doing a lot of work and analysis on it to then try to gain some insight into what's going on under the water. And the reason that I'm spending a reasonable amount of time going over this sort of process of data collection and data analysis is the reason why we focus so much on the overarching themes is that's what's going to give us the insight into what's going on in the basic assumptions that are going to enable us to drive improvement. And that process of getting to those overarching themes was extensive and took a significant amount of effort. And in the report, we present some of the evidence that supports those themes. But it's important to be clear about the distinction between evidence that supports a theme and the theme itself. So the focus is really on trying to work with those overarching themes. And I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But the reason why, both in all the guidance that we've given and all discussion we've had, we have asked SoCalGas to put effort on understanding the overarching themes is that they are the engine or the driver of the culture. And if you don't address and work on that level, you're not going to improve. And while it's tempting for organizations to focus on fixing the more visible, more tangible aspects that we identified through the assessment, that's a mistake, because ultimately, unless you address the stuff that's driving those factors, you're not actually going to improve and move in the right direction. And often targeting one finding or one particular theme that's identified could send you down the wrong direction in terms of what you're trying to achieve and improve. So it's really important, I think, that you understand the process and what we were trying to get at to be able to understand these basic assumptions. I'm happy to answer questions about that. So that's a recap of where we got to when we got the report 3 years ago. What the report provided was a rich description of SoCalGas's culture and identified some overarching sort of themes that were identified as potential cultural drivers that SoCalGas could use to guide their improvement. Next slide, please. So now that they've done all of that, actually the first step of the safety culture improvement, which sometimes I think seems counterintuitive, but the next step is for SoCalGas to understand what the report is telling them. Now you might think, why would I need to understand it? You've written the report, we know the answer, let's just fix this thing. But actually, the process of really understanding what this is telling us and why it is the way it is an absolutely crucial part of the process to be able to improve. If you don't spend the time deeply thinking about why is it this way, why do we have these cultural themes, what does it mean in terms of how we're approaching safety, that you're not going to be successful in finding an intervention. So there was a significant amount of emphasis placed on to what extent does the plan demonstrate an understanding of what's going on at a cultural level. And to develop that understanding, you need to engage staff across your organization. So that's why there was a lot of discussion about dialogues and about really understanding that process. Once you've understood it, then you work collaboratively with the same groups of people to design some interventions, which is really about thinking, well, what would really help here? How could we address this issue and be able to move forward so that we can address the underlying driver of that thing? What would we need to do differently for it to change? And that's, again, quite an iterative process. It's engaging lots of people, lots of thinking, lots of discussing. But at some point in time, you have to write down stuff you're going to do, okay? And in that sort of process, you're going to say, we're going to implement a range of different initiatives, a range of different types of activities that we're going to do based on this understanding. In this collaborative design process, we come up with this list of things to do. And when we're writing our list, we need to, at the same time, create a set of indicators that are going to help us know whether we're moving in the right direction. And that's a really important aspect of this process, that when we say we're going to implement a particular initiative, we need to be able to say, we're doing this thing because we think it's going to impact this particular aspect of our culture and it's going to address this area where we want to improve. Here's what we think is going to change, and here's how we know we're going to be moving in the right direction. So we need to specify those indicators before we go to the next level. And these should be things that tell us that we're moving in the right direction. And then we implement these initiatives, and that implementation, we can then track how effective we're being by looking at the indicators that we have put in place. And then we go through that loop again. Because this is a very much an iterative process where we make some changes and we move to the next, we try and adapt and we move along and go forward again. The metaphor that I've tried to use for this is we go from an initial understanding, we design our process, and then when we start to move forward, it's like we're sailing a boat, a sailboat. And we have a plan, we have a direction that we're heading in, but we really aren't able to sort of drive like a motorboat. We have to go with the wind, we tack, we change direction, we know where we are relative to our destination, but we can't maybe always go there as directly as we would like. And that's why the indicators become really important. We set off with a plan, we think the plan is going to be effective in this particular way, then we find it's not as effective as we would have liked, and we have to change and tack and change course. So one of the things that I think is important about any safety culture plan is it's going to need to be adaptable. The only way it's going to adapt correctly is if it's got good indicators. So I know for people who've been at these meetings before and have listened to me, they're tired of me talking about how important the cultural indicators are, because ultimately they're the thing that tell you if you're moving in the right direction, if the initiative is having the intended impact on the process. The next slide, please, Carolina. And so this is the sort of summary about what safety culture improvement looks like. So I've spoken about the model in the middle, about understanding, designing, specifying your indicators, and then implementing the process and how that's continuous. And it is also built on a foundation. So this process requires a number of things to be in place. So there needs to be some internal expertise to guide the improvement. So the staff who are employed, the leaders need to understand what culture is and what that process is about. There needs to be a broader understanding among the leadership team and employees about what we're trying to do. The senior leaders need to be committed to improvement, so they need to recognize that there's an opportunity to be better than we currently are, and that process is important. There needs to be the internal specialisms to be able to develop those indicators and monitor the change, and the people need to have time to engage in this process. And those are the things that, as we've gone through this number of years since the report has been released, that we have been trying to guide SoCalGas through to try to help them to build that internal expertise, to ensure that they've got the managers and leaders have got the time to invest in it, and then providing them feedback in terms of how this process is going to work and improve. And I'm hoping, having listened to this, that you have an appreciation that this approach is quite different to how we normally do improvement within organizations, where in a typical safety assessment, we come up with a list of a gap analysis where this is what the standard says, this is what you're doing, here are the 22 things you need to fix to be in line with the standard. This is much more open-ended, and the extent to which the plan is a good plan really depends on the extent to which it reflects an understanding of the initial report in a comprehensive way. So to what extent does it demonstrate that that report has been understood, has been sort of synthesized and made their own? How much have they engaged a wide group of people within their organization in designing the improvement initiatives? To what extent have they been able to describe those improvement initiatives, and more importantly, create cultural indicators to tell them that they're moving in the right direction? When they do implement something, are they able to tell that it's moving in the right direction and that it's having the impact that they intend? And when it's not having it as much as they would like, or it's not working at all, then they're going to have to go back and say, okay, we tried that, it didn't work. Okay, we're going to have to try something different this time. And that is an iterative process. This is a very challenging thing to do. And that's why it's maybe taken as long as it has, because of its complexity. So I think I wanted to give everybody here a sense of how at least I and the advice I've been providing to the CPUC to think about this process. And also I've been trying to draw the line between how the assessment report recommended a certain approach and how the approach that was recommended in the report, you can still see that line has been followed through into how the improvement plan has been implemented. Okay, that's all for me.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for sharing your insights and expertise. We have certainly used just as much as we can from your expertise, so we appreciate everything you've shared with us so far. We still have one more portion of our presentation, and we'll have some time for questions after that. But I do want to just do a quick check if there are any clarifying questions so far before we move on. And I'm going to have to stop sharing my screen so I can see any any comments that come up. Just give everybody a second. Okay, well, let's not delay then and continue with our presentation. Okay, so on to the evaluation. So as mentioned earlier and also alluded to by Dr. Fleming, the decision last year, D-23-12034, it required SoCalGas and Sempra to head back to the drawing board and develop a revised plan based on the output from organizational dialogues, and essentially those are modified initiatives 1A and 1B, that's what we'll call them, to implement recommendation number 3 of the 2EC report. So it adopted that and required SoCalGas to adopt that. So basically that's for the utility to conduct dialogue sessions with all levels of the organization to create a shared understanding of the assessment results and organizational unit. The objective of the sessions would be twofold. One, self-reflection of the culture based on the assessment results, and 2, capture the organization's intelligence and creativity on how to recover the areas in need of attention. Action items should result from the dialogue sessions that will meet the objectives of this session. So what does this mean? It's essentially exploring through organization-wide dialogues the drivers behind the assessment results, and to use the output from those dialogues to develop the improvement plan. The decision's expectation for the plan aligned with the improvement cycle, just a process that Dr. Fleming just presented on. And I would also highlight that the principles and elements adopted in the scoping memo that was issued for this phase of the proceeding also are premised on SoCalGas and Sempra demonstrating a shared understanding of the assessment results. So let me just move here. The decision essentially required expansive documentation demonstrating nature of the examination, whether the dialogues achieved the intended purpose from a cultural perspective, how the examination informed the revised plan, description of the cultural insights, description of process used to reach the conclusions illustrated by examples. Summary of dialogues must be filed with the revised plan, describing how and why the improvement plan was revised based on the outcomes of the dialogues. So this is all just pertaining to the dialogues. And as you can tell by now, because these dialogues are pivotal to the improvement process, SPD, supported by Dr. Fleming, engaged in significant level of oversight of the development and implementation of the dialogues. To be fair, I don't think the report does enough of a job of conveying the level of engagement that we had during that period. Because, you know, the report really focused on the plan itself. But for example, you know, we held bi-weekly check-ins that were not just reporting off activities, but rather it was an exchange of expertise, of expectations, providing feedback and guidance were appropriate. And I say were appropriate because this is very tricky, as Dr. Fleming just mentioned. It's very tricky, especially because we're doing it in a regulated space. So we're trying to balance a lot of expectations. And I say we're appropriate because, for example, you know, first, this is self-reflection approach, and this is new to us in SPD, and it's new to the utility as well. So we navigated what it means to self-reflect under the requirement and supervision of the regulator, pretty much. Through this process, we as staff also learned a great deal alongside Dr. Fleming. And for example, you know, among the challenges we encountered were providing guidance while never telling the utility what to do or how to do it. Because it not only takes away from their ownership of the plan, as it's the intent, but the utility is then implementing something that it doesn't understand, doesn't know exactly potentially how to do it, and then might not know how to figure out if it's working or not. So we really never went, it was a fine line we try to balance during that process. So this makes it a very difficult process to manage. If the utility doesn't understand what they're doing and why they're doing, and they won't know why they're being successful if we are to go ahead and be prescriptive and tell them exactly what to do. At the end of the day, they are the only ones who can manage and judge whether this is working for them or not. And in our regulatory climate, the utilities are used to and expect to be told by us exactly what to do. So we had to continually remind ourselves to hold back from doing so. This is not only based on the ownership principle for improvement, but also taking into account the assessment report's observation that the CPUC contributes to the compliance mentality. So we try to be very conscious of that during this process. Through the advice letter that SoCalGas was required to provide, we not only reviewed the proposed metrics for the dialogues, but also the process for the dialogues and their assessment. But the reality is our continued check-ins and dialogue provided a lot of the engagement to really understand what it was that they were trying to do. Dr. Fleming and SPD observed several dialogue sessions, both virtually and in person. And we provided feedback on each of the sessions. We probably could have a whole session on just the lessons from this particular process of kind of supporting, providing feedback, general direction, and not telling SoCalGas exactly what to do. This forum is to focus on the plan, but I just want to highlight this because we didn't focus on this in the plan, but dialogues are pivotal, and we've gained a lot of insight into how these were implemented through the process. So we think it's just important to provide you all that insight here in this forum. So our review was based on evaluating the plan against three main sources of criteria. The first is the criterion guidance provided in the scoping memo. That is the principles and elements that were laid out there. The expectations set forth in last year's decision, D23-12034, and consideration of the continued improvement process that Dr. Fleming presented on earlier. And that process is essentially supported by the directives and expectations provided in the proceedings so far, so everything is aligned. I won't spend too much time in this, but the scoping memo essentially issued number 2 of the scoping memo asks whether SoCalGas and Sempra's proposed plan meets the Commission's required elements. It outlines 8 principles and 11 elements, and these focus on embedding a systemic approach to safety in SoCalGas's plan with a foundation of continued improvement that is systematic. So that's kind of the foundation of those principles and elements. What's most worth highlighting, though, in terms of our evaluation and sort of a theme, as you see from what Dr. Fleming and myself are presenting, is the first element, and it's highlighted to the right. This requires SoCalGas and Sempra to develop initiatives to address the 4 overarching themes as informed by the report's findings, conclusions, recommendations, and associated goals. So these are the principles that are also referenced. And last year's decision, again, it rejected the plan and sent SoCalGas back to the drawing board. It laid out numerous expectations for the revised plan. These are primarily related to requiring SoCalGas to file a plan that demonstrates a shared understanding of the assessment results. And again, this is just a highlight of the importance of that particular process in to result in a plan that has a chance of being successful. So the decision did that by having the utility first execute and evaluate organizational dialogues to reflect on the underlying cultural factors, cultural forces driving the assessment results. If you recall, as I mentioned, TWICI advised addressing the underlying cultural forces, which these dialogues are intended to uncover. The decision expected development of plan initiatives whose objectives are directly connected to the results and the output of the dialogues, and sets expectations for metrics that measure the effectiveness of the initiatives at achieving the desired objectives. It also requires expansive documentation of the dialogues with narrative summaries included in the plan, showing the nature of the dialogues, what was learned, and how the output informed the revision of the plan. Again, that expansive documentation is what we were looking at. Does this demonstrate them going through a process of building a shared understanding? Is it reasonable? And to in the process of understanding, this makes sense given our understanding of the assessment reports. And also it addressed SEMPRA's role in supporting change. So this is a diagram of our systemic evaluation process, and I say systematic, excuse me, process. So we did this for all of the overarching themes and followed the same logic. First is looking at the utilities' understanding of the overarching themes. This is following, again, TUIC's recommendation of addressing the underlying cultural forces rather than each individual area in need of attention. So this means whether SoCalGas looked at and understood the evidence supporting the overarching themes rather than when to address each area in need of attention. So I mentioned that because we had a couple of questions from parties come in about what SPD meant by assessment findings. So the assessment findings, when we say assessment findings in the report, we generally mean the overarching themes as informed by the areas in need of attention, the positive aspects, the conclusions, and the recommendations, and general report goals. So basically the same language that is used in the first element of the scoping memo. So why we want to point out is that we've had 3 years to become intimately familiar with the entire report. This is what we do day in and day out, at least for SPD. But in actually implementing what that means, the overarching themes is informed by, all of these other aspects of the report, is really whether SoCalGas looked at and understood the evidence supporting the overarching themes rather than went ahead and addressed each item. So their understanding of the report was informed by the evidence used to support the overarching themes. This is what element 1 of the scoping memo supports. That's different than going item by item for the 154 plus facts to checkbox. Each one has been addressed and with, what action or what not. So we looked at how SoCalGas formed their own interpretation of the report rather than just ignoring the areas of need attention, but what is their interpretation of this evidence as the overarching themes. We want to highlight this again just to address those questions about how we looked at the cultural facts, which are the areas in need of attention in our evaluation. So we use the 4 themes as informed by the recommendations, conclusions, areas in need of attention, and positive items. We looked at the process for SoCalGas to understand those areas in need of the overarching themes, which is essentially the dialogues, and it's this entire period that we've been engaging and conducting oversight activities of their understanding. That aside, even though we've got all this internal insight into how they've done it, all of that to some extent has been memorialized in the summaries that were filed in the plan, and whether those have demonstrated they have gone through this thorough process of understanding the results of the assessment. Then we look at the intervention and how that intervention addresses the underlying factors that were identified by SoCalGas through the dialogues. And finally, looking at the indicators and that these indicators evaluate and assess the objective of the intervention, so the effectiveness of that intervention at achieving its objective. Hopefully that was clear enough. So her high-level takeaway. So in summary, we found that the plan meaningfully reflects on the cultural drivers of the assessment findings, incorporating evaluation of dialogue output to develop the revised plan. We saw there was a change of tone from avoidant, defensive to one that was more self-critical. And we found that all of these elements that I just went through in my review process were better connected to each other, which was the intent in having clear objectives that are connected to assessment findings and indicators that are connected to those objectives. And this also has resulted in improved metrics. So these items themselves are indication of, some cultural growth, so to say, within SoCalGas during the process. We saw them, as we did, also grow the expertise and understanding of what it means to improve and how to go about it. And it also means, it seems that the work required to really head to the next step of improvement has been put in place with this foundation of understanding what the cultural drivers are. So it's an improvement from, definitely a very big improvement from the previous plan, and it would indicate that they are at least heading down the right path by having identified drivers through a very thorough process of dialogues, and then identifying initiatives that address those drivers. So one thing, we approached the review intending to preserve SoCalGas's ownership of this improvement plan. So that's that same approach that we just mentioned. We had to balance between providing guidance and feedback, but also restraining ourselves from telling SoCalGas exactly what to do. That's the same approach we utilized in reviewing the plan. So that's why we were trying to apply the same restraint. We want to preserve their ownership of its effort, and also understand that while it's very tempting to strive for perfection, this is probably not the right space to be striving for perfection. That said, there are some enhancements that we do think warrant consideration, but overall, I think the utility did a good job with its revision. We found that, the revisions do meet the spirit and intent of the expectations and requirements. So again, on a side note, I do want to highlight that this is the first public and transparent effort of its kind for this type of culture assessment that we are aware of. SoCalGas has been open to us coming in and taking a look at their dialogues, and open their doors to having myself and Dr. Fleming give them feedback on these dialogues and observe what was happening. So that has given us another level of insight. And they have been open to growing their internal capacity, which was something that Dr. Fleming did mention earlier, that is going to be critical for their ongoing growth. If they're going to implement this plan, they will need to grow their internal capacity for safety culture in order to do that, to execute. So bottom line, we're really doing something that no other regulator has done before in this open forum. So we are a little bit in uncharted waters. But in summary, we found that the plan, meaningfully reflected on the drivers, and that's a pivotal aspect. So for our observation, our primary observations are in element 2, actually. Element 2, element 3, and metrics. So we'll start off with element 2 first. Element 2 is intended to address the assessment findings related to SoCalGas's compliance mentality. SoCalGas explored why it is the way it is with the dialogues and identified that there's an assumption that it's not worth it to do more. This is one of the drivers that they've put forward, has been identified as an underlying factor. So to change this, SoCalGas intends to empower employees to challenge, question, and speak up. However, the actions it proposes to support that effort are more commonly related to occupational safety. While we're not too convinced that these measures will be effective at promoting SoCalGas's objective, our main concern here is that the actions provide limited opportunity to advance a speak-up culture for public safety. So the main finding of the assessment was that SoCalGas views safety too narrowly as occupational safety. So we recommend that SoCalGas mitigate the risk of undermining efforts to emphasize public safety and consider how to promote a speak-up culture for more than occupational safety. So it's mitigating that risk of using activities that are traditionally associated with occupational safety in order to speak up, to promote a speak-up culture for all of those aspects of safety. We have a secondary recommendation on the corrective action program. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but we do recommend SoCalGas consider expanding the scope of this corrective action program, whether it be as part of a phased approach or as part of the immediate effort to build a system that captures a comprehensive breadth of issues from across its organization, including those that are raised by contractors. So with element 3, this is our second observation. So the assessment found concerns around how SoCalGas allocates resources to support safety. Through the dialogue, SoCalGas found the driver to be a mismatch between expectations and resources, representing it in its plan as the cultural driver of its never enough. To address this, SoCalGas proposes using a tool called learning teams to explore with employees select topics related to the resource allocation matters. While this could be reasonable, the number of learning teams it proposes could use some additional evaluation, whether these will be enough to give them the systemic insights they need to implement organization-wide initiatives to address systemic issues around resource allocation. So, we essentially recommend that SoCalGas consider, either using the concept of saturation, which we explain, and we can go in a little bit more detail about, but using the concept of saturation, and I'll, if anybody has questions, Mark's an expert on that, but it's really essentially conducting enough learning teams that will give them the information they need to be certain that they've conducted enough of these data collection efforts to gather systemic issues. And if not, to actually use some other type of approach to demonstrate that they will be collecting enough data points for the systemic insights. Some other observations are around improving the baseline metrics for some of the metrics or indicators that they've proposed. We did observe the plan provides no cost estimates, so those would be very useful to have. The check act components of the continued improvement are somewhat weak, and we recommend these sort of be enhanced and formalized and documented. This, we think it's important for the iteration concept. And then we observed that Sempra's contribution was minimal. So the decision did lay out expectation for Sempra's role, primarily as supportive of SoCalGas's improvement process. And we did not observe that evolution from the last plan to the current plan. And finally, we have some recommendations on flexibility. We do believe that the IOU needs to iterate the plan as it learns new information from monitoring and tracking. However, the changes might warrant more scrutiny while balancing, the regulatory burden to achieve the changes. So we also recommended setting the expectation that plan iteration must occur in response to monitoring of the plan. So plan should be iterated, not be sort of, if there is a change, I think we need to expect that there will be changes. And we also recommend modifications to the quarterly reporting to account for, this new phase of plan implementation. Okay, so now I am going to stop sharing so I can see your hands raised, and we are happy to answer questions. And I believe there's some questions that were sent to us that remained unanswered, so feel free to bring them up at this point. So perhaps I am going to just go over a few of the questions that were provided that were not answered directly through the presentation. This question comes from Cal Advocates, and the question is, did SPD have opportunities to provide subject matter resources or safety culture expertise to SEMPRA? And then the answer to that is no, we did not have much of an interaction through this process with SEMPRA. Where the other question is, were SEMPRA employees or officers involved in any oversight activities observed by SPD? If so, what was the nature of SEMPRA's involvement? We observed members of the SEMPRA executive team involved participating in the leadership dialogue. So that's that we did observe that. And did SPD have opportunities to discuss SEMPRA's progress with Propolo Consulting, the safety consultant name in the revised SEMPRA plan? The answer is no. We focused on activities on SoCalGas. So while we did interact with Propolo, since Propolo was providing also support to SoCalGas in addition to SEMPRA, our interactions were about SoCalGas, and yeah, they were limited to SoCalGas. Now, there is another question from Cal Advocates, and this is the SPD report recommends that the revised plan should evolve via plan iterations that continue through the next safety culture assessment. At that time, the revised plan may be replaced with a new plan based on the results of the future assessment. Regarding the recommendation that the revised plan should evolve via iterations until the next safety culture assessment, what does SPD envision the approval process to look like? So the recommendation was that every second quarter there would be approval of the annual report, and to leverage the annual report as a tool to have the changes reviewed. That approval can happen, I think, ideally could be at the SPD level if it's appropriate. Reason I think I would say it's appropriate just based on reducing that regulatory burden and implemented the changes. So we've had about 3 years since this plan has been in the works, and a lot of this is just really should get going. The assessment's almost pretty much 3 years old at this point. And there was a question about that particular approval process, if that were to happen, about which parties would have read-only access and would any party provide comments. So I personally wanted to just get some clarification about what this, what is meant by read-only access. So I'm not sure if there's anybody here from Cal Advocates that could provide some clarity. Okay, well, what I would perhaps,
Carolina, Mina has his hand raised.
oh, I didn't see that. Oh, yeah, Mina, go ahead. I'm not sure if I need to unmute you. I don't think have the ability to unmute you.
Mina, I have, go ahead, Mina.
Mina, I think you've been unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I have a question related to what was mentioned today as well. I see the point for that Dr. Fleming is raising, that it's challenging and complex because we're between a scale of two two different things. The first one is very specific. We do gap analysis. We have prescriptive action of what to do, and let's call this like zero trust. And the other side is we have full trust in SoCalGas, and we kind of let them do and develop the plan and executed. The challenge here is that I see we have to be at a certain point between these 2 points, and the key point that Dr. Fleming mentioned was to have a good plan, and I'm having a hard time to understand how we can assess a good plan while we are like SoCalGas, and I kind of understand if that this might be like a natural thing to do, is that they are trying to reduce their commitment to the minimum. So they want to be they want to provide a plan with minimum commitment from their side. So even if they have the willingness to make the change and to do that, but they will provide a plan with the bare minimum that they can do. So how to assess a good plan while we have this kind of conflict of interest of having we need to commit to the minimum while we still have to achieve improvement in safety culture.
Carolina, do you want me to answer that, or do you want to answer it?
Mina, it sounds like your question's sort of directed at Dr. Fleming, is that
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I suppose I would see it slightly differently. I think that while it is really important that SoCalGas owns the plan, it's their plan, they have developed it. It is not simply that whatever they propose we accept. So it's a complicated process. And the metaphor that I've been using for this is how I advise PhD students. So the thing is, when you're doing a PhD, it needs to be your research. You need to do it. It needs to be independent, and you need to be the person creating it. You can't do it because it's what your PhD advisor told you. But at the same time, you need to produce something that is a contribution to knowledge. So there's a standard in which you'll be judged against. So on one hand, it was essential that SoCalGas produce their own plan, and that I and others did not tell them what to do, even at times we maybe were desperate to do so. And then when they produced the plan, then we evaluated it to say, does this meet the criteria of an adequate plan? And the first plan had many limitations, which we pointed out, and there was additional work that needed to be done, quite substantial work, to produce this revised plan. And that I think is a significant part of it. So it's not that simply whatever they produced we trusted. It was, does this plan demonstrate a thorough understanding of the issues, and does it address those issues? And even this revised plan, there are things that could be better, which the feedback we have provided. And when they start to implement the plan, we're probably going to find that there's things that don't work, and they need to be continually held accountable to say, we did this thing, this is what we found. And that's why a lot of the emphasis has been placed on the metrics. In the sense that I think in my role, in the role that I've been playing, I'm playing in some ways a supportive role, an education role to SoCalGas, to say this is what it means. These are the things that you need to think about. Have you thought about this? Asking questions, trying to encourage them to think about things differently. But my secondary role, and probably the more important role I think that I play here, is when they have completed a document and they submit that to the CPUC, we go through that and critically analyze it and evaluate it and judge it and give them feedback. And in that, that is critical and important. So that's the sort of verifying piece. So we need it for them to be their plan, but also we also need it to be a quality plan. And I think Caroline has mentioned, is the plan perfect? No. But the thing that's tricky about this space is the only way to understand how to make the plan better is to start to implement the plan. And that part is going to be an important process as well, that will continue to have some oversight, I would imagine. Does that answer your question? I know, Mina, I tend to talk too long, so sorry. We may have to restate the question just to make sure I've tried to answer it. So I don't think it's a 0-1 thing. I think maybe we could talk about be from 1 to 5, where 1 is very prescriptive, 5 is just do whatever you like, no oversight, and I think where we're at is 3, where we're saying you need to own this plan. It does need to have certain features, and we're going to evaluate it. And I think that balance is a difficult balance to strike, but I think we've done a reasonable job of that in a way that we've tried to be transparent.
Yeah, I see your point. That helps with answering my question. However, like, for example, from what we learned about today and what Karina mentioned, like, let me take, like, let's look at it from regulator point of view. Like, we saw Sempra didn't expand much on their plan, because why would they commit more while they can commit less? That's my point. I totally get what you're saying regarding the plan, and it has to support or provide some like quality actions. However, I see a filter that's not present in like the PhD students, because with PhD students, you both want to get to the same target. However, here there is kind of conflict that the more we commit to, the more we will be held accountable. So I think this is kind of a little different, or the main difference here between those two examples, and something that will support the commitment part is that we didn't see Sempra expand on their plan or provide more stuff to commit to, or to be accountable for in their plan. So I'm not asking for a yes, no question, but I'm trying to show our struggle to how we look at the plan and our challenges from our side as a regulator to how we look at the plan in this view. So I hope you get my point and the question.
I do. So I think you're right. The part I didn't mention is that, you know, how good is good enough, right? And there is, I think, an inherent conflict of, you know, if I was simply advising SoCalGas, well, you don't want to commit to something you can't do, right? So there's always a tendency to want to be careful in that level, and the focus has been on that. To what extent does this address that underlying issue, right? And how clear is that for others to be able to judge? So when you look at SoCalGas's plan and the recommendations in the report, you can see how, okay, this broadly speaking, you can see how that's moving in the right direction, and it's not very, it's looking at it in a rich way, and they can explain the rationale that they've made, and it's a pretty rich picture that they have presented. In SEMPRA, it's a little bit more complicated. The report and recommendations were narrower because of the nature of their relationship. And, you know, at least I was less involved in the process and they, you know, in their development of the plan. But I think, you know, it's very possible for the CPUC and this process to look at that plan and say, well, to what extent do we feel that it's adequate or not, right? And I think there have been some comments in the staff report in that sort of domain. I've had maybe less to say about that, just because my focus has been on the more substantive SoCalGas part of the process. But that is a part of the judgment, Mina, is to what extent is this proposed plan substantial enough that it's going to have some hope of addressing the issues. And more importantly, particularly the focus I have had on the SoCalGas plan is to what extent would they know they're moving in the right direction? So, you know, to what extent do we have that insight to know that the improvement is being made? So those are the criteria that I very much used when evaluating the SoCalGas plan. The SEMPRA plan provided less information, so there was less for me to consider. And, you know, I think the staff comments mentioned that, but I think that's a totally valid question to ask. I don't have the answer, so I'm not SEMPRA, but it's a valid question to ask.
If I may just add a little bit to that, Mina. Yeah, probably in this regard, the SEMPRA example might not be as useful because of the difference in recommendations and roles within what came out of the report. So your question, you know, doing the minimum on the SEMPRA side is one thing. So let's, you know, knowing that, you know, our focus had been really on SoCalGas. I think
Right.
I would then.
I was trying to give just example of
Yeah,
the
no,
nature of the utilities, which is that's fair on their side. I mean, usually, and everybody, if I'm in their shoes, I will do the same. If I can provide a plan with a minimum commitment, I will do that. So, but that's our role is to make sure that we need to fix the problem to improve the basic assumptions that underlying this to make really change on the safety culture. So we need to have a plan that's effective, that's not like cut from to in order to reduce the commitment of the utility.
Right. And so, yeah, and taken, Mina, I completely understand that came up as an example. I just wanted to like make that separation because you probably have other examples and we don't have to go through them that related to SoCalGas. What I wanted to point to a little bit, and this is the part that maybe isn't highlighted enough in the report, but at least for myself and for us at SPD, it's very, very important, is the iteration. Why? Because the iteration isn't, there are two aspects to the iteration that we try to convey. One is filling in more details and information about this plan, because it's more concrete, definitely, but as implementation happens, there's going to have to be more detail about what will be implemented and exactly how. And that's we expect that those details be filled in. But then on the other hand, on iteration, there's also what is learned from each element that is implemented and how effective they are. And I think what maybe isn't clear enough, or maybe we need to highlight more, is that we expect that there has to be action stemming from this monitoring of effectiveness. I don't think we can come in expecting that everything's going to work, and we want to make sure that we see SoCalGas taking action to making changes and improvements as they're seeing whether things are working or not. Then another aspect here is, which probably wasn't as also wasn't highlighted as pivotal, but it is this expectation that some of these elements yield new insights. So even let's assume they work, but as presented, they will yield new insights, like this corrective action program or the learning teams. There has to be actions as part of the iteration that goes through the next assessment. So we can't expect this plan to just end with what we're being told in the plan will be implemented. There is more work that we have to lay out, an expectation that has to happen. And I think that's the part that maybe wasn't conveyed enough, and it might speak more to what you are getting at. It's like, okay, well, is this enough? And it's like, well, no, we expect there to be more. And maybe that expectation hasn't really been clear enough, but there has to be more. These actions have to result in more. There has to be more that happens. I don't know if that makes sense. And this, as we recommended, at least this should go through this iteration, and this exploration of more has to continue through to the next assessment when they get a new picture of their culture. So I think those are some items that maybe were buried in the report, but those are some I mean, important iteration aspects about the plan.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Although the work is not done yet. Okay, well, we're getting close to our 10-minute break, so I want to, any other last-minute questions from parties about our presentation, the review, the approach? I didn't go into too much detail on the actual observations because they were, well delineated, I feel like, in the report. But if there are any questions, please let us know. And also, if you have anything that you want to send us offline, I mean, do send us after the workshop as well, and we're happy to answer questions. I'm not seeing, let's give everybody a minute. All right, well, last chance, no further questions. I think we can take a 10-minute break. So let's see each other back at 3:36. Welcome back, everyone. That was a short 10 minutes. Now we will actually hear from SoCalGas. So let me make sure that we have Jason Egan from SoCalGas ready for the presentation. Hi, Jason. I'm just going to hand it over to you now.
Perfect. Am I coming through?
Yes, I can hear you.
Perfect. And actually going to start with Cedric.
Thanks, Carolina. Thanks, Jason. Good afternoon. I'm Cedric Williams, Chief Safety Officer at SoCalGas. I started with SoCalGas in 1989 on a construction crew, and I've held roles of increasing responsibility over the last 36 years. And I've been in this role as Chief Safety Officer since 2021. So I've had the opportunity to be involved from the assessment to the development of our first plan to the development of this revised plan, along with all of our efforts in between. And this proceeding has really driven our efforts to promote greater understanding, learning, and change and improvements at SoCalGas over the last several years. And I don't want to just say it; I want to actually speak to it. So, we've actually integrated new ideas and philosophies around safety that address the challenges and issues identified in the safety culture assessment. We've built our own internal cultural capabilities and are now much better positioned for future assessments and improvement efforts. And we've vastly increased our dialogues with our employees and other stakeholders so that we can identify opportunities and approaches for changes and improvements. Thanks to these efforts and the CPU's constructive challenging and support, we've made strides and are continuing to enhance our approach to safety. A really good representation of how the evolution of our safety culture has shown itself is during our response to the recent Los Angeles wildfires. I'll give you 3 specific examples, for context, I'll reflect back a little bit on our foundational aspect of our safety culture journey, which started with redefining safety for our company, from a focus on the absence of incidents and accidents to defining safety as our ability to recognize and mitigate hazards and the capacity to put in place systems that protect against catastrophic failure. So along those lines, the first example is, the unified alignment of key leaders in the organization to shut off gas service to 30,000 customers. This number is historic in its magnitude, and the prioritization of public and infrastructure safety led to fast alignment and unanimity among the senior team around taking this course of action. To advance employee safety, we recognized and mitigated potential hazards around smoke and ash caused by the fires, and implemented daily testing of air quality indexes out in the field by our safety advisors, and established policies and procedures that elevated our PPE requirements for entering fire damaged properties when there was no clear guidance from external agencies on how to do this. So our process of assessing the extent of the hazard and then ensuring effective countermeasures really exemplified our culture journey from a compliance mindset to more of a risk mitigation mindset. And finally, the public information element of our incident command structure really elevated our efforts around public safety and service by conducting an aggressive suite of media communications, informing customers and the public about the safety reasons for the disruption in gas service, and then creating transparency around the safe restoration process. So the revised plan reflects our change in thinking. And as has been stated, our original plan was well-intentioned, but it didn't reflect the same level of collaboration and self-reflection. Our original plan was more focused on fixing identified issues without enough focus on the drivers that created those issues, which would have led to superficial change, but not sustainable change. To address the gap, we engage multiple internal and external stakeholder groups to talk about safety and culture and make sure we understood the challenges identified in the assessment and incorporated them into our path for improvement. For example, we conducted over 90 dialogues with hundreds of frontline employees. We had engagement with our contractor partners. We held multiple half-day sessions with the executive and directors from our organization with participation from SEMPRA. And we really focused on what would have to change in the way that we approach things in order to have the culture that we wanted. Through these processes, we developed our Safer Together North Star to align our efforts in advocating a culture that empowers communication, curiosity, commitment, and collaboration. For each of the themes identified in the 2EC assessment, we identified an underlying assumption within our culture that was creating more visible artifacts of our culture. We then developed improvements to target those drivers, which we believe will lead to a deeper, more lasting change. So for the 2EC theme that found that safety was most often perceived as personnel safety, we found that it was rooted in how we understood safety, with success previously being defined as by lagging metrics with a focus on personnel safety. So our plan looks to change this assumption by integrating more comprehensive approaches to safety in our goals, in the way that we communicate, and the way that we set performance and manage performance within our company. For the 2EC report theme that found that safety and risk are perceived as achieved by compliance, we found that that was driven by the fact that we had limited incentives for folks to go beyond compliance and a poor track record of organizational follow through and transparency. So our revised plan proposes to improve the way we engage people in developing improvements and developing better corrective action management tools and a comprehensive system around corrective action management to be more intentional and transparent about how the organization follows up on issues once they're raised by employees. For the 2EC report theme that found that resources are needed to shape a healthy safety culture, we found that that was based on a feeling that folks felt that expectations were unrealistic and that there were competing priorities that didn't always set people up for success. So our revised plan proposes to leverage learning teams, which Carolina referenced earlier, and more dialogues, and make that part of our ongoing approach to really enhance leadership's understanding of the challenges and to demonstrate our commitment by following through and communicating on the learning team proposals that come out of those dialogue sessions to align safety resources along with our expectations. Lastly, for the 2EC report theme that found learning and safety improvement requires an integrated management system, we found that this stems from feelings of organizational silos, which limit communication, learning, and improvement, and creates a lack of transparency. So the revised plan promotes integration, alignment, and collaboration through a major enhancement of our safety management system, which is the result of cross-functional and cross-level effort undertaken over the last 2 years, which we'll be rolling out this year. Regarding the SPD evaluation on SoCalGas's revised safety culture improvement plan, we are certainly open to the recommendations to further improve it because we all share the same goal, right? A strong safety culture and safety excellence. And I think this proceeding has provided a collective opportunity to integrate modern academic thinking as well as good practice across industries regarding safety culture. So I and SoCalGas is thankful to the commission staff, and stakeholders for their continued engagement in this proceeding. And now I'll turn things over to Jason Egan, our Director of Safety Strategy and Culture, to share our thoughts on how we would action the SPD recommendations.
Perfect. Thank you, Cedric. And are folks able to see my slides? I'm not sure if, Carolyn, you still have control or if my slides are up.
Slides are up, but you have the cover page. So I just want to make sure that that is where you're at.
Yep, that's where I'm at. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks, Cedric, and thanks, everyone. Well, wanted to spend some time today really just walking through our current thinking as to how we could integrate the improvements recommended by in the SPD report, really looking at what's recommended, how we're thinking about how that could be integrated into improvements for our plan. So for each slide in our presentation, we've identified the bolded actions, the bolded recommendations in SPD's report, and then are thinking about what we could do differently or how we kind of interpret and think about how we could take action based on the recommendation. Wanted to start with the element 2 activities that were identified in the SPD report. Regarding the risk that certain proposed improvements are rooted in employee safety practices and that could undermine efforts to emphasize public and infrastructure safety, we certainly agree these practices have traditionally been associated with occupational safety. We think it's important to acknowledge that risk. Our intent with taking this approach was to try to see how we could integrate comprehensive safety considerations, specifically infrastructure and public safety, into these practices to try to expand their focus. What we wanted to try to do was to change existing work practices, not add new work practices, so that we are not having one occupational safety approach and then a separate process safety approach. So looking at how we could make sure that we have a consolidated, comprehensive way of thinking about our different safety activities and processes and conversations. So again, important to recognize the risk that was flagged in the SPD report, but we think there's value in creating a more expanded, evolved way of thinking about some of these employee safety practices that could be broadened to include more conversations, more considerations of what-if scenarios, more considerations of potential impacts to infrastructure and the public. And importantly, we want to do that collaboratively with employees so that employees are participating in setting the safety standards, developing related procedures, and fostering an understanding. So we are promoting that questioning and curiosity and commitment, really trying to make sure that we're reinforcing the why behind these procedures and the why behind the importance of the dialogues and conversations that are happening across the organization. Important component is formalizing into those practices collaborative discussions on safety for the public, for our infrastructure, for employees, for contractors. Again, we recognize the risk flagged, and we want to be thoughtful about measuring whether that risk is becoming a reality. So we do intend for our proposed measures, the work observations, for example, to be a tool for us to help understand whether or not those challenges or impacts are coming to be. So looking at what we're learning, looking at what we're doing, and seeing whether or not we need to iterate, whether or not we need to change, or whether or not this is proving to be an impactful lever with which to kind of embed a more comprehensive view of safety considerations, non-occupational and occupational, into these really important conversations that happen at a work site, happen in a meeting, and are happening across the company. So our goal is to try to change the way work is done rather than add new activities on top of existing. The next one also was related to element 2, really looking at the recommendation, the SPD report recommendations around our continuous improvement tracker. We identified activities to integrate. These were things that we identified as important systems to track continuous improvement opportunities and challenges. We want to make sure that we're integrating these things thoughtfully, integrating systems in a way that's easy to navigate, it's transparent, it enables resolution and follow-up. We want to make sure that in putting together more process, that we're doing it the right way, in a way that adds value to people. We don't want to add administrative steps. So our initial activities proposed within the OII, or excuse me, once the initial activities proposed in the OII are complete, we do think there would be value in expanding the process as part of future improvement efforts, seeing what else could be integrated and embedded into the continuous improvement tracker. So I think the SPD report suggests kind of a phased approach, and we think that would be a preferred way to go forward. That way, rather than trying to do everything all at once, we're integrating what we think are important initial steps, learning from that effort to integrate, seeing what we're learning from people that are interacting with the tool, seeing how it improves transparency, seeing whether or not it's having a desired effect on people's view that organizational follow-up, organizational action are being realized. And then that can help us inform what to do next in terms of additional process integration, as well as different or enhanced communication and engagement with employees. For the suggestions on improving the learning teams, this is a simple one. We agree that saturation analysis would be valuable. We had identified 5 to 6 learning teams we were planning to convene, looking at constraints and challenges related to safety, change management, change overload, how we could become more efficient, opportunities to improve knowledge transfer, expand expertise. But we recognize that for each of these, by design, the learning team is very explorative. The goal is to really identify challenges and then explore possible improvements with employees. So this is something where I think performing the saturation analysis on the results of the learning team will really help support the process of learning and improvement and make sure that we've engaged in learning teams in a way that has some backing, that what we've identified is fully exploring the challenges in the 2EC report and identifying adequate and detailed recommendations for improvement. So a simple one, we think that's a valuable improvement and something that we could add as an additional measure for element 3. For the measure baselines, what we can do to add add detail on how we're planning on measuring change, measuring impact. We agree again and propose to continue developing more detailed views of our measures through the quarterly reporting. We did attempt to expand upon several of our measures in our most recent quarterly report that was filed in December of this year. What we did there was took the table that we included in our filing and created kind of an expanded summary document that would allow us to provide more information on data collection, the purpose of the measure, how we were assessing baselines, what we were learning through those measures, the results that have been gathered so far. I've included just an image of what we did for one of those to try to identify, I think as the SPD report suggests, specific findings from the 2EC report related to that baseline. So rather than pointing at themes, it's pointing to specific items from the 2EC report. So our plan is to continue this process of kind of improving the amount of detail that's in the measures. In our next quarterly report, we will do the same. So in keeping with this recommendation, really looking at what we can do to expand upon, make sure that there's transparency, a common understanding of what's going into the measures, a common understanding of how we're measuring what we're learning, and then what baseline we're using with which to track and understand change over time. So I think this is another one where we agree there's value in doing it and have started doing that in our most recent quarterly report, and something that we think we can continue working with stakeholders to expand and make sure that these measures are serving a real important dual function. It's allowing us to measure internally impact and progress so that we can iterate change and make sure that we're seeing kind of the desired impacts, and then also are something that has value externally to make sure that there's the right degree of transparency, understanding, and that they are good kind of tools for questioning and shaping direction. On the recommendation for more clarity on what we mean by a more comprehensive view of safety, here the intent was to measure really change in conversations, change in dialogue, change in communication, wanting to understand whether or not we are seeing an expanded focus on non-occupational aspects of safety, things like public and infrastructure safety. The end goal really is to understand whether or not the actions that we've outlined in our revised plan have broadened the organization's understanding of safety, and whether or not conversations around safety indicate that safety is now being viewed, discussed, and engaged around it more broadly than in the past. So the intent is to look for how the measures can help indicate whether or not in conversation, in dialogue, in how safety is viewed, communicate, discussed, there is a broadened scope with which safety is understood, and again, more focus on the non-occupational aspects of safety. So really broadening that viewpoint so that there's more discussion of potential impacts to the public, to our infrastructure. And again, these are things that we can further clarify in comments, and then also make sure it's more explicitly drawn out in our quarterly reporting as we're going forward. For the recommendation to have more structure around the monitoring of implementation and adjustments to the revised plan, we did want to first offer just a little bit more context around our current approach, because I think that's something that maybe helps explain how we've been thinking about the CA component of the PDCA cycle. At SoCalGas, we have developed a program team that supports kind of company-wide connectivity and alignment and measurement around our safety culture improvement efforts. That includes centrally monitoring progress, centrally monitoring the measures, regular meetings to provide kind of a check on direction, working through project charters and direction to make sure that we have alignment across actions and elements, wanting to make sure that there is some kind of centralized pull and direction that makes sure that before work starts, it's aligned with our Safer Together North Star, and that as work is implemented, there's a regular process to check and make sure that we're identifying challenges, identifying risks, that we're intentional about measuring and understanding impact, and that we retain kind of connected, integrated, and aligned towards our Safer Together North Star. In terms of implementation, what that looks like, we do have leads and leaders that are responsible for the elements and actions that are laid out in our revised plan. We have ongoing senior management oversight through regular executive sessions. We have regular weekly co-creation, integration, report out meetings with the broader team. And then we've continued to engage expertise through engage safety culture experts, and then leveraging our advisory safety council as kind of an independent council that we can use to engage external experts and external perspectives on our safety journey. So trying to make sure that we have kind of centralized program rigor, but then also external expertise that can help challenge, help question, and help us understand different ways forward. And then I'd say kind of wrapped around all of that, having kind of real ongoing public reporting and transparency. So using that program management machine I mentioned as a way to make sure that we're delivering things internally, but that we have things structured in a way that we can communicate and report out publicly when we get questions, when we have quarterly reports due, when we need information on what we're seeing, what we're learning, and what we're doing. And then the last one, very simple, regarding the plan iterations. We do agree that the process of continuous improvement is important. We think it should involve ongoing learning, improvement, and sustainment. So we think this is a reasonable suggestion for how we could continue to evolve our approach to safety culture improvement. So again, wanted to provide kind of a brief reaction in our thinking on what we could do in response to the SPD report. We think that the suggestions are meaningful and are things that could help improve the plan through implementation, and then also kind of help us as we're thinking through what those next steps could look like, how we can make sure that we're continuing to think about this as something that needs to require humility, ongoing learning, and ongoing improvement throughout the process.
Thank you, Jason. We have an opportunity to, for parties and everybody who's participating, to ask questions. So I just want to give everybody the time to think and then ask you some questions, Jason and Cedric. While folks are wrapping their mind around some of your responses, SoCalGas, I wanted to just address one point that came up in your presentation around metrics and the quarterly reports, and this is actually relevant to a question that was provided by Cal Advocates, and is about the timing of your quarterly reports. So I'll remind everybody, SoCalGas mentions that they made some additional clarifications or added some details to their metrics in their last quarterly report. That report was submitted to the Commission at the very end of December, but the SPD's evaluation did not take into account that report as it was completed, and this report was drafted prior to your submittal of that report. That said, I did want to, we will obviously be taking a look at that report, but one thing I wanted to clarify about the suggestion of the baseline metrics is that ultimately the intended, in you looking at additional benchmarks that you can look into the report, we do want to highlight that there's probably opportunity for you to be able to find baseline metrics in your own documents that are more an apples to apples comparison of the activities that you're actually trying to measure. So I think that's where we would be focusing and looking at what you're proposing in your quarterly report. But I think it's ensuring that there's that apples to apples comparison for the baselines. And for everybody's benefit, the baseline is essentially the benchmark we would use to evaluate whether there's progress made based on the initiative that is being implemented. So it would be based on that baseline. Our recommendation brought up the issue that the 2EC report was often used as the baseline, but we think that there's issues with that. On one hand, it assumes that there's a zero, that the utility is at zero, where that might not really be the case. And another, and more applicable to this apples to apples comparison is that it was using the overarching themes, and these overarching themes are, as we presented on earlier, they're high level and try to integrate a lot of other different activities and observations. So they're not really granular enough and specific to be able to act as a benchmark for the specific initiative that you are proposing. So we need a more apples to apples comparison in order to be able to assess the effectiveness of that initiative as you implement. And so, for example, I'll just go out there, with the safety management systems, you have had safety management system, you've been using this for a while, and, we would think that you probably have some more data there that can be dug up to be used rather than the 2EC report.
Yeah, just say agreed. We have been looking at other information we have from that time frame and more recently that we could use that would provide, as you're saying, a more apples to apples comparison of a baseline to what we're trying to effectuate change upon.
Thanks, Jason. We do not have any other questions yet. So I may just also ask a few questions in the meantime. You, on your first observation, Jason, you discussed how with element 2, this is essentially around our observation of mitigating risk of emphasizing personnel safety again with those measures that you proposed. You provided a little bit of the intent with those activities. You mentioned one of the reasons you mentioned was for doing it that way is because you didn't want to have different practices for one thing and another elsewhere. I wondered if you can just provide an example of, specifically, let's just give you an example. What practice would reside in a different place for process safety, whereas with your approach, it would not reside anywhere else at all, but in that particular activity? Just my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. So an example to use, we outline a plan to develop kind of formalized and detailed structured tailgate practices before work commences. I think that would probably be fair to say traditionally has been viewed in the realm of occupational safety. It's primarily focused on hazards and incidents that could impact someone at a job site. What we're proposing to do is also integrate considerations, kind of those what-if scenarios related to the infrastructure as well as the public in that immediate vicinity. So trying to make sure that we are embedding those sorts of public infrastructure impacts into something that may have traditionally been viewed as having a very occupational safety focus. So to give a specific example there is traditionally the question might be, what are the things at this job site that could seriously hurt or kill you? And what we would want to add to that conversation is not just what are the things that could impact you, but what are the things around the work that's being performed that could have an impact on the public, that could have an impact on the system, and make sure that that's embedded in the conversation around the work being performed, why it's being performed, the purpose of it, what it's intended to accomplish. That's where we say trying to consolidate that into one conversation was the goal, rather than have it be kind of a separate conversation around the purpose of the work, potential risks, potential impacts.
Thanks, Jason. I guess my confusion was when you say consolidate, that to me means that already exists elsewhere. So you're consolidating these two things in one, but from your explanation, I understand it would be new. You would be expanding something rather than consolidating it with something that's elsewhere. Is that correct, more or less?
That's correct. And maybe it's just a misunderstanding of the recommendation, because I interpreted the recommendation as suggesting needing kind of a standalone non-occupational safety focus. So what we were trying to suggest is that we think that it's not an either or, that it's more impactful if it's a both.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. And then just to give you feedback on that recommendation, it certainly, we did understand it. I mean, in that you have these activities that you're proposing, and then it's not really, you're not proposing to consolidate anything. You're just proposing to expand on what you have to include this other scopes. And I think for us that concern would still stands, that because this is still traditionally an occupational safety, traditionally being viewed in the occupational safety realm, you just expanding something that within that realm already, we don't think that will have the impact necessarily that you might intend. There's essentially a risk that you could be emphasizing personal safety. And so then you talked a little bit about the metrics. What we didn't really see in the plan, a discussion that particular element would be tracking whether it was having an impact on comprehensive safety or not. Rather, metrics were all directly connected to just whether there was a change related to that narrow objective. So no interrelation with the element one.
The metric that the measure, and to use the tailgates as an example, we would point to is the observation of the tailgate meetings to see whether or not the change in guidance, change in training, kind of change in purpose created a different sort of conversation at those tailgates. So we plan to have kind of a job observation approach similar to the assessment itself. So go out there and observe conversations at the work site and see whether or not some of the observations around that personnel safety focus have been changed by changing the way that we are thinking about different practices at the work site. So has it resulted in the measure would be, has it resulted in a change in dialogue at the tailgate? So the measure we would point to would be the tailgate observation or the meeting observations.
Well, and the metrics themselves didn't say that though. They don't. They commit to what you mentioned, just exploring this what the tailgate conversations are, but they're not the objectives of what you want to see and what good looks like aren't concrete. That you are actually looking also for an improvement in this other space or a change in that space. There isn't any concreteness around those objectives, and I think that's pretty much it. So it currently as it stands, it doesn't really, in our sense, really reflect that objective of also expanding. So, what we are asking is that risk does need to be mitigated, and you're telling us that you intend to do that, but the metrics you provided don't really support that yet. At least the way we've reviewed it. So, obviously this probably merits more conversation, it sounds like, but. Gonna check on any other questions from attendees.
Rachel Sweet has her hand up.
Please go ahead. I don't see you on my list. Oh, Rachel, please go ahead. And
Thank you. Rachel Sweetnam from Center for Accessible Technology. We've been focused on comprehensive safety and making sure that public safety is included with consideration for vulnerable populations who have specific safety needs. We appreciate the presentation and the definition provided today of comprehensive safety. And just wondering if this and communications about comprehensive safety include recognizing that certain populations, such as those with access and functional needs, have heightened safety needs and considerations. Is this something that's included in communications about safety?
Thank you. In our plan, we did have kind of an expanded definition of it becomes a bit reductive to say everything kind of fits within public infrastructure, employee, contractor. So in how we defined public safety, we did explore issues around emergency management, environmental safety, customer data privacy, accessibility, protection of the public from harm caused by our operation or our assets, the safety of vulnerable populations. So in the definitions at the end of our plan, we did try to include expanded definitions for what we meant by our definition of comprehensive.
Oh, thank you for highlighting that, and yeah, appreciate any clarification and work on incorporating that into communications. Thank you.
Thanks.
thank you, Rachel. There were some questions by Cal advocates that were submitted originally, and this particular question was directed at SoCalGas, so I'm just going to go ahead and share it with you. Okay, so the question is, has your team discussed the SPD report with any Sempra employees or officers? If so, did the employees, officers indicate that they will provide information for future SoCalGas quarterly reports?
Yeah, we have been looking at providing information through future reports. We do have regular meetings with the Sempra team. They've been engaged and supportive throughout the process in terms of providing support, expertise, information.
Thank you, Jason. And I'm just going over all of the questions to make sure that were submitted earlier to make sure these have been addressed. Okay. I think most of the ones that we received were addressed, but let me check in with Cal Advocates. And Mina, are you still on the line with us? Not to put you on the spot there. All right. Well, I have one more question in the meantime. And just a moment. I just wanted to clarify for you, Jason. You mentioned you mentioned having some measures in place for the Check Act piece of the PDCA cycle, which was brought up as one of the recommendations. So I just want to clarify that with that recommendation, we're not only looking for SoCalGas having committees and feedback, but actual processes, formal processes in place. And we just want to see that demonstration of these formal processes being in place that are intended to monitor and then take action on the monitoring of the implementation of the activities. And the reason for us that is important is because this is information that, as we have discussed today, is what you'll need to use to make changes. And that's what's going to ensure, at least from our end, that you have the systems and the processes in place formally to make sure that this loop can actually happen and that the plan iteration will happen. Just for clarity. So from my perspective, if you have a board and you have an assigned lead, it's not really sufficient to show us that there's processes in place that are connecting everything to make sure that there's action at the end of the day.
That's helpful clarification. So we have ongoing process. We do have we do kind of charters that go through a normal kind of review process, and then we do identify measures and deliverables and timelines associated with those. If I'm understanding what you're saying, it's making sure that we also have additional formality around how anything that's learned results in iteration and change to the plan on the back end, so not only on the front end. That's helpful. We'll look at what we can do to provide additional kind of formality and structure around what that process looks like.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments? And feel free to ask from Dr. Fleming, myself, or SoCalGas at this point. We're all here to answer your questions.
Carolina, earlier I was not able to unmute myself, so now I was moved to the panelist, so I can mute myself. Do you have a question for me?
I did. I wanted to make sure that we have addressed your questions and that you had submitted a list of questions, and I want to make sure that we've answered or provided some information useful in answering those. Are you able to unmute? Okay.
Yeah, for most of them, I think you're okay. Yeah, I think, yeah, you answered them. I think earlier you were having a clarification question regarding my question or the question that we sent.
I did have a clarification question on, you had submitted a question regarding the, let me just read it out to you so that I can be clear. So you had a question regarding how, just looking down. Okay, so this is question 4B, and this was with respect to our recommendation that the revised plan should evolve by plan iterations and continue through to the next safety culture assessment. At that time, the revised plan may be replaced with a new plan based on the results of that future assessment. And your question was, if SPD decides to pursue an approval process every second quarterly report, what would that process entail? And we discussed that a little bit earlier. Then is which parties would have read-only access? And that was my, I wanted to just kind of understand what you meant by read-only access to that.
Oh, yeah, I think this is because of if all parties will have the ability to be part of the process, or will like have ability to attend all the meetings, like to have like open process and to be there while you are developing this approval, or kind of discussing this approval, or it will be only limited to SPD and SoCalGas. So that was the core of the question, or the background of the question.
Okay, so what we were suggesting is the approval itself. That would be that filing, and that's public. That is, everybody would have access to that filing of the changes in the quarterly report, essentially, and that should be available to everybody. And I think it already is, and it's submitted to the distribution list as an approval. I wonder, Mina, if there's how you.
I mean to have the opportunity to comment, reply, comment before you provide the approval.
Gotcha. Well, from what we recommended, we certainly recommended that the approval process, have that balance between being expeditious and reducing the burden to be able to get approval, right? But with also having sufficient scrutiny. So, there's different levels, advice letters have, you have a 30-day process for a tier 1. A tier 2 has, approved, requires an approval as well. Whereas a tier 1 is like deemed approved before, unless commission rejects it. Usually that 30-day, to be honest, it seems like a 30-day window would be beneficial to have something expedited. I wonder, and this is just, I'm curious, how you have found the engagement with SoCalGas so far, and how you found that may have worked or not worked to help your group understand and you being able to voice your concerns, and versus the, a formal comment. I'm just curious what your experience has been so far with that.
I think it was very helpful to understand what they've been doing, and that clarified, like, SPD was part of it, Dr. Fleming was part of it, and I think this conversation helped to clear many questions, and help us to understand what they have been doing. So that's, I think, being updated on monthly basis, like what we used to do, what we're doing right now is very helpful, and I think the amount of questions and concerns that we have now is way less than how it would be if we haven't done that. So I see this as a helpful process, and I think I'm assuming you have the same impression. You have attended some meetings with us as well. So I think it's helpful, and that's where we are coming from, actually, by having the parties being updated, and part of the process that is usually helpful, and having all the parties to see the complete picture will that also help us to appreciate the amount of work that SoCalGas make with meetings, and meeting with their employees, and representative for their contractors and stuff like that. That help us to understand what they have been doing on this side. Otherwise, we would have more questions, and we would have been not informed with what's going on, and we will have more questions about this stuff. So I think it's very helpful, and that's why we appreciate if this will continue, and to make it available for the parties to be part of this comments. And because I look at the comments and reply comments period, is we are getting more input from more parties that that will enhance the process. Yeah, I understand it takes time. That's the nature of it. But like what you mentioned, it it has been 3 years already, so I think it's not. It's reasonable. It's I don't like the term like reasonable delay, but it's worth to have input from the parties to enhance the plan and the improvement of the plan.
Yeah, and you're right, Mina. Thank you for mentioning that. I think that our experience mirrors yours in that the actual filings, and this is complete transparency, aren't as informative as the actual meetings and conversations that we've had. I think that had we just received the plan, we would probably also have 1,000 more questions and really just be taking the time and delaying the process longer rather than having been plugged in from the beginning and being able to understand how things are coming along. So our experience mirrors yours. And so I guess what that leads me to consider and wonder, I mean, if there's just room to continue rely on that more one-on-one meetings and where we're able to kind of everybody share their concerns and understand what SoCalGas is doing rather than rely on filings and formal comments that then only delay the process because we haven't been plugged in through the mid period. And I guess that's just been my learning process as well through this. I have gotten a lot more in SPD through our check-ins and through our regular conversations with them and with you, with your team as well. Those are actually also very valuable for us to hear what everybody else is kind of thinking. So that's why I asked, because I think we also share that sentiment.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and yeah, I think input from parties will add value too. So I think it's worth it.
I don't know. I mean, is there, for example, SoCalGas to just ask? I mean, do you plan or do you intend to continue the level of engagement you've had with parties and, for example, SPD in your implementation phase as you have during this development phase?
That's been our plan. I think we actually just extended our advocates for 2025 last week. I think you should have, Mina. So yes, our plan was to continue having the same level of engagement and conversation.
Perfect, thank you.
Well, I'm going to do one last ask for questions or comments from everybody who is attending. I don't see any hands or comments on the chat, but let me just confirm.
So
this is okay.
Oh, hi, okay.
There are no comments.
No comments. Thank you.
I think the last part of the question for B that I sent you is how do you think the optimal timeline for the approval process so I understand that like what's your target to expedite the approval process, and where are you trying to like pros and cons of the options that you considered in order to improve the timeline?
Generally speaking, I mean, 30 days seems to be just the marker that we can definitely target, unless there's reason for concern to suspend and dig further. In which case, you know, that, I mean, if there's sufficient reason to suspend and dig further, then that could be done. The reason the meetings seem to be useful is because we can probably try to anticipate in having all the discussions ahead of that approval. That way, it's not just when it comes in, then we're doing all the evaluation, and we can actually all be discussing about what all that really means proactively rather than just when it comes in, when there's a filing. And the intent is to have that front loaded rather than on the back end.
Yeah, I have a thought while we're talking right now. I think 1 month is reasonable if the plan will not have, if the approval is not for substantive update for the plan. I'm okay with that. That's reasonable. However, because there is an option to update the plan through those quarterly reports. That's my understanding now. So I think if there is a big or substantial change in the plan or updating for it, then like 2 or 3 months would be reasonable to approve those. So I don't want us to like limit. We need to get the approval in 1 month and make this as like a hard target. If we are approving an update, that's totally fine. However, if there is like something substantial that need approval, then more time will be reasonable. That's just a suggestion. Think about it, and if it makes sense to you, then yeah, we're happy to apply it.
No, thanks for the suggestion. I mean, I think there's certainly difficult to anticipate every single circumstance that could arise out of that review. And obviously, I don't think that our suggestion would be to take away the ability to like suspend and just take additional time if it's necessary. I think there's definitely the circumstance where we could be uploading as much and SoCalGas could be providing as much ahead of time, but we wouldn't want to just be held to a 30-day if there is reason to dig deeper, which may require more time. But as a general practice, I think we could probably commit to a 30-day, unless there's substantial reason to, you know, dig deeper than the 30 days allows. And this is just, I wonder if there's any reactions from SoCalGas and how you've seen sort of approval or not impact your own timelines.
I suppose I'd have to think a little bit further about that. I think anytime there's more this, it has the potential impact to impact timelines. But you know, as kind of shared by both you and me, I do think that conversations have been really bad in terms of making it where we're thinking
Jason,
about things.
I don't know if it's just you, but I'm hearing you sort of cut out. I don't know if it's also the case for everyone else. I'm not sure.
Let me lean forward. Sorry. Is that better?
I think so.
Okay, sorry. I'd have to think a little bit further about that. I think it, as with anything, it kind of change in the process involved.
We're still having. I'm sorry. Some technical issues. Maybe try it again. It might be connection issues. I don't know if IT can help jump in or give us some guidance.
It might be his connection. I guess Jason's trying to call in very quickly.
I did call in. I had this problem in the past, so I did call in this time. This is on my phone. Is that any better?
Just to support Jason a little bit, Carolina, can you just re-ask the question. I was having a little bit of problem following what you and Mina were talking about. Frankly, is this some kind of a decision on our plan, or what are we talking about doing in 30 days?
Oh, I don't think it's right here. There's any decision making at this point. This is really just a discussion, and Cal Advocates has had some questions about what approving changes to the plan looks like, and I will pull this thread back to our recommendation in that rather than thinking that there's not going to be any changes, I think that we recommend there be an expectation that there are going to be changes and that we expect SoCalGas to be monitoring the effectiveness to make changes that are in the realm of improving the plan for safety culture. So that's the kind of changes we're talking about. But the discussion was around, well, what does that approval look like? What kind of time frame should that approval have? Because we pointed in our report that we see there's a balance here between the regulatory challenge of getting that approval and also having timely approval to implement the plan and kind of have move forward with what you need to do. So we were discussing some timelines about whether, we have 30 days or whether, there's certain circumstances which we might not foresee that may require longer. But those maybe being more the exception rather than the rule. So my question to both to yourself and Jason is around what have you so far seen are kind of the impacts of this decision to your implementation timing, and just curious really how that has worked from your end.
Yeah, I guess I had just envisioned changes to the plan once we got to a place where there was alignment that the plan is directionally correct. And we've also discussed with you and with Mark that iterations to the plan is just a natural part of this process. And as our evaluation of implementation metrics became evident to us, and it would trigger course corrections or leaning in more on things, that we would share those in our quarterly reporting process with the commission. And absent any violent disagreement, then we would just assume that's how we would continue to move forward. I don't have a sense for what the end game looks like for this, and that's probably not going to be discussed today. But at some point, as this process is iterative and will never end, some understanding of what the end of a proceeding looks like versus the never-ending nature of a safety culture improvement machine that we've now put in motion.
Thanks, Cedric. Yeah, I don't think your observations too far off from sort of what Cal Advocates and SPD were just discussing. And Mina, feel free to chime in if you think that maybe I'm misinterpreting. But I think generally it was, having this established timeline. The report, and just, Cedric, the report did come out recommending that there be an approval for changes. And for changes, I mean, we define this iterations of all sorts with specific goal of improving safety, that the changes are with the intent of improving safety culture, and that those might deserve additional scrutiny. And so the discussion is around, that timeline, what does that look like? And hence my question to you of, well, what is this timeline of approvals, for example, would has had an impact, for example, in the past year or so on your own implementation? And so that's pretty much where everything was coming from.
Okay, Jason's back on the line, but my the way I would answer that question is, I wouldn't say that it's slowed us down. We are embarking on things that we think are the right things for our company to do because, as you mentioned earlier, we own our safety culture and are leaning fully into it, understanding that the commissions need to want to monitor what we're doing and have, input on it. But even the course corrections that we've made over time, I think have just been helpful in terms of, number one, broadening our understanding of how we're approaching this, but also validating that some of the things that we think we need to be doing with some minor tweaks and corrections are the right things to be doing. So, Jason, I don't know if you'd elaborate on that any differently.
Yeah, we'll see if this is any better. I tried a different, a little bit better. No?
No, I think we're good, and we can continue our conversation in our biweeklies, Carolina, just to make sure we're on the same page as you are.
Jason, try to turn off the video and see if the voice will be better.
Yes, Jason, you could try switching your audio back to
I
computer.
think see if that's any better. If not, then what Cedric said is I totally agree with. The only thing I was going to add is I think where it might become challenging is understanding what triggers different levels of approval, because I heard some things maybe a month and then maybe some are longer. So what raises to the level of requiring additional process? I think that uncertainty would be one thing I would flag potentially challenging, just making sure that we know what needs to be done from a process standpoint. But what Cedric said is absolutely right. We've been moving forward with things that we think are just really important to what our core obligation is, which is to deliver energy safely.
Thank you, Jason. I think that was, we could definitely hear you better there. So I appreciate all your feedback and input. And so I'll do one last check. We have a few minutes left for our session, and we can end early as well if there aren't any additional questions. But I'll give everybody one last chance. I've said it before, but this really is the last one. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing anybody else raising hands or any comments in the chat. But with that, I think that our next steps are that SoCalGas is going to develop a summary of today's workshop, and we'll circulate to the parties for comments and file it with the proceeding. There are comments due, and if you give me just one moment, I'm going to pull up that slide so everybody has it. We have comments due on February 19th, and then reply comments on March 5th. So I hope that will give everybody some time with the summary as well. If that's needed for your comments, we'll give you some days to use that. And then PD no later than 90 days after submission. So that's sort of where we're standing right now with the proceeding. With that, I'm closing the discussion and question session, but I do want to thank Dr. Fleming first for sitting with us this long. He is 4 hours ahead of us, so he's well into his short bedtime. Thank you for your insights, and SoCalGas for taking the time to look at the report and provide some responses so we could discuss today. Cal Advocates for your questions, appreciate it. I think we will all be continuing our discussions, both with Cal Advocates and SoCalGas, and to all the other interveners that engaged us today. With that, I do want to check if Commissioner Hauk is on with us, and see if you have any closing remarks that you would like to share with us.
I just want to thank everyone for the discussion today, the questions. I'm looking forward to reviewing the comments when they come in, and just appreciate all the time and attention to this really important matter.
Thank you, Commissioner Hauk. And with that, thanks to all of the participants for sticking around and listening to everything that we had to share today. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care. Good to speak to everyone.